My name is Vel Khan, third lore keeper of the Conclave of 60 Worlds, and I am writing this record with shaking hands. Not because I am old, though I am. Not because I am ill, though the events of the last cycle have done little good for my health. I am shaking because I have just witnessed something that should not exist. Something that every civilization in this galaxy, from the oldest star-grazing empire to the youngest colony world, had agreed by silent consent would never happen. Someone broke the rule. Let me be direct. Let me be honest. I have spent 4,000 years recording the history of this galaxy. I have filed reports on wars, on the births and deaths of entire civilizations, on plagues and treaties, and the slow drift of stars. In all that time, in all those years, there is one entry in the Conclave archives that had never been followed by an addendum. One law so old that no one alive remembered who first carved it. One line, written in the original script of a language no one speaks anymore, etched into the great stone wall of the conclave chamber, where every delegate must pass it on the way to their seat. Do not cross the humans. That is all it says. No explanation, no list of consequences, no historical footnote describing what happened the last time someone tried. Just those 5 words, and beneath them, the symbol for absolute prohibition, the kind used to mark things like breathing vacuum or drinking from a neutron star. The kind that does not say this is unwise. The kind that says this is the end. Every new species that joined the conclave asked about it. Every ambassador, every scholar, every young diplomat who walked through those doors for the first time tilted their head at that wall and asked the same question. And the answer was always the same. We do not know who wrote it. We do not know exactly when. We know only that it predates every living civilization in this galaxy, and that the species which might have remembered are gone. That last part usually ended the questions. I'm telling you all of this because you need to understand the weight of what happened when the Vetharak Dominion stood up in full session of the Conclave, all 40 of their delegates in their tall silver armor, and Warlord Sarex, their supreme commander, their chosen voice, a being so confident in his own power that he once described the Conclave as a room full of history's losers, looked at that wall and laughed. He did not just laugh. He pointed. He said, in a voice loud enough for every translation implant in the chamber to carry clearly, that is why you are all still small. You let words on a wall decide what you fear. No one responded. The older species, the Eldar Vreth, the Mouth of Tides, the deep ocean shellborn of the Aurelius system, they did not argue, did not shift in their seats, did not even look at him. They looked at the floor, at the table, at their own hands. That silence, I remember thinking, was the loudest thing I had ever heard in this room. Sarek sat down, satisfied. He had come to the conclave that day with a specific purpose. His dominion had expanded for 200 years without pause, absorbing smaller civilizations at the edges of explored space. And now they had reached a border. Not a conclave border. Not a line on any official map. A human border. A colony. A small one. 43,000 people on a world called Caro Landing, near the outer spiral arm, a place so far from the human core worlds that the light from their nearest major city took 11 years to arrive. A farming settlement, mostly. They grew a grain that didn't exist anywhere else, something about the soil chemistry, and they had been there for 6 generations. Sarex wanted their transit corridor. The colony sat between 2 Vetharak expansion zones, and moving around it added weeks to supply lines. He had sent them notice to relocate. They had declined, politely but firmly, citing their legal settlement rights under Conclave Charter. He had sent a second notice. They had declined again, this time attaching the charter article number. I learned all of this afterward. I learned it from the human diplomatic record, which is the most thorough, calmly written, and quietly devastating document I have ever read in 4,000 years of reading documents. What Sarex did next was send ships. 31 warships to a farming colony with no military installation, no defense fleet, no weapons platforms. 31 warships and the orders they carried. I will not describe in detail what those orders contained. What I will say is that when the Conclave received the alert from the Caro Landing monitoring station, a standard automated signal, the kind that triggers when a settlement goes silent, I was the one who pulled up the visual feed from the system's outer relay buoy. I watched for a long time. Then I closed the feed and sat very still in my chair. The other lore keepers on duty that shift noticed my stillness and came to look. One of them, a young Vresi named Ol who had only been doing this work for 30 years and still thought the galaxy was fundamentally reasonable, looked at the feed, looked at me, and said, "What do we do?" I said, "We record it." "That is what we do." "But we record it," I said again, "and we wait." I did not tell her what I was waiting for. I did not want to frighten her. She was young, and she still believed that the galaxy's worst moments were behind it. I had lived long enough to know that the galaxy's worst moments are never behind anything. They are simply waiting for someone foolish enough to call them forward. Sar-X returned to his seat on the conclave floor, the following session, looking pleased with himself. The older species said nothing. The younger ones murmured and shifted. A few of the mid-tier civilizations raised formal objections. Sar-X dismissed them with a wave of his hand and a speech about historical precedent and territorial necessity. I was not listening to the speech. I was watching a transmission that had just arrived from the outer relay network, a tight beam signal broadcast on every standard frequency, cutting through every diplomatic channel at once. The kind of signal you use when you want to make absolutely certain you are heard. It was short, no preambit, no identification code. Just a voice, a human voice, calm and level, with the particular quality that human voices have, that strange resonance of something deep underneath the surface. And it said 4 words. "We are coming now." The session room went quiet, not the polite quiet of a pause between speakers. A deep, held quiet, the kind that fills a space when everyone present has just understood something at the same time. I looked at the wall. At those 5 carved words in the old script, worn smooth at the edges from thousands of years of passing hands that touched them without thinking, the way beings touch things that feel important. I looked at Sar-X. He was smiling. He said something to his adjutant, something quiet and dismissive that I could not hear across the chamber. His adjutant nodded, though I noticed the adjutant did not smile back. Then I looked at the oldest delegate in the room. The Mouth of Tides, an Eldarvreth elder who had been attending conclave sessions for longer than the Vetharak Dominion had existed as a political entity, was already rising from his seat. He did not say anything. He did not make a formal motion or request to speak. He simply stood, gathered his things, and walked toward the exit with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and exactly why. At the door, he paused. He turned back, not to look at Sar-X, not to look at the chamber. He looked at me, just at me. And in 50 years of attending these sessions together, it was the first time he had ever looked at me like that. Like he was sorry for what I was about to see. Then he walked out, and somewhere in the outer spiral arm, 43,000 names waited to be remembered. I sat down at my desk that night and opened a new record file. At the top, I typed the date. Then I sat for a long time with my hands over the keys, not writing, just sitting. Then I typed. The rule was broken, and I knew that everything that came after would be different. I knew it the way you know a storm is coming not from the clouds, but from the sudden silence of every living thing around you, the way the world holds its breath before something enormous arrives. The Vetharak were the storm. They were loud and bright and fast and powerful, and they had never in 200 years of expansion met anything they could not move through. What was coming was not a storm. I did not have a word for it yet. I would find one eventually. But that night, sitting alone in the archive chamber with the old carved wall at my back, I could only describe it as the feeling of standing at the edge of something with no bottom, looking down and understanding for the first time why someone thousands of years ago had felt it necessary to write a warning. Not as a threat, as a kindness. There's a particular kind of silence that only old things know how to make. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something choosing not to speak. I have cataloged 1,112 wars in my career. I know the sounds of conflict, the rapid-fire chatter of diplomatic channels, the elevated alert tones from border monitoring systems, the high-pitched urgency of military transmissions being encoded and fired across the void. War is loud before it starts. It fills the air with noise and hurry and the particular anxiety of people who have decided to do something irreversible. What followed Sarex's action was not loud. The Eldar Vreth, 12,000 years old as a civilization and the longest-standing members of the Conclave, began pulling their orbital stations inward within 6 hours of the human transmission. No announcement, no formal notice. Their border relay posts simply went dark one by one, like lights being switched off in a house before sleep. I flagged this in my records and sent an automated query to their diplomatic liaison. The response I received back was 3 words in their formal script: observing from safety. The shell-born of the Aurelius system, who had not left their home cluster in 800 years and had no military presence whatsoever, nevertheless filed a movement of population notice with the Conclave Transport Registry, registering 11 million civilians for internal relocation to their deep ocean habitats. No reason given. They did not need to give one. The Vresi, the Malkine, the twin species of Dorith and Dorith Mirror, all of them, separately, quietly, without coordination that I could detect, began doing some version of the same thing. Moving inward, pulling back, getting small and still and out of the way. I watched all of this from my desk in the archive chamber and felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. In 30 years, Ol had become a sharp and careful lore keeper, and she was the one who finally gave voice to what we were both watching. She came to my desk early one morning before the session bells and stood there with a data tablet held loosely at her side, the way she held things when she was trying to look calm about something. Every species that was here before the Vetharak, she said, is moving away from the outer spiral arm. Yes, I said. They're not mobilizing. They're not sending aid. They're not doing anything diplomatic. No, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, they know something we don't. They know something no one alive should know, I said. And I meant it exactly as strangely as it sounded, because what I had found in the archive over the previous 3 days had unsettled me in a way that 4,000 years of record-keeping had not prepared me for. I had gone looking for context, for history, for something in the files that would explain why those 5 carved words carried the weight they did. I had searched the oldest physical records, the ones stored in sealed containers, because the materials they were written on were too fragile for open air. I had used translation tools layered 4 deep, because the language shifted so many times over so many thousands of years that a direct translation would produce nonsense. And I had found, eventually, a fragment. Not a history, not an explanation. A fragment of something that might have been a meeting record, or a treaty, or a court filing. The date on it, as best as any of our dating tools could estimate, was approximately 6,000 years ago. The fragment described a species called the Kovari. They were, from what I could piece together, a powerful civilization of the mid-expansion era, technologically sophisticated, politically unified, with a territory that covered what is now the central cluster of the Conclave's founding worlds. They were, by every measure I could reconstruct, significant. They were also entirely absent from every other record in the archive. Not missing, not lost, not damaged by time or disaster. Absent, as in, every reference to them existed only in this one fragment. No other civilization's records mention them. No trade agreements, no border disputes, no diplomatic exchanges. Nothing. As if 6,000 years of galactic history had simply continued without them, and no one had noticed the gap, except that the fragment existed. And the fragment described, in very dry administrative language, a border dispute. A small one by the sound of it. A question of transit rights and territorial water on a planet whose name I could not fully translate. And on the other side of that dispute, named plainly and without any particular emphasis, were the humans. The fragment ended there. Whatever came next had not survived, or had never been recorded, or had been removed so thoroughly that not even a ghost of it remained. I sat with this for a long time. Then I went to find the Mouth of Tides. He was not easy to find. The Eldar Vreth do not maintain permanent residences in the Conclave district the way most delegates do. They move, slowly and without pattern, through the older sections of the station, the parts built in the first century of the Conclave's existence, when the architecture was heavier and the corridors wider. designed for species whose bodies were larger than what most members carry today. I found him eventually in a deep corridor near the original Foundation ring, standing in front of a section of wall where someone had painted, a very long time ago, a map of the galaxy as it was known at the time of the Conclave's founding. It looked very small. The known galaxy 600 years ago was a humble place. Lore Keeper, he said, without turning around. His voice was the sound of water moving over stone, slow and continuous and very old. I found a reference to the Kovari, I said. He was quiet. Then he said, one fragment. Yes, only one. That is all there ever was, he said. We checked long ago. Many of us together with every tool we had. One fragment, and that was after they were already gone. I came to stand beside him and look at the old painted map. Gone how? He turned to look at me then, and his face was the face of something that had watched too much for too long and had reached a state somewhere on the far side of grief. The Kovari disputed a border with the humans, he said. A small thing, the kind of thing that happens between neighbors. The humans were patient. They requested resolution through proper channels. The Kovari refused, and then escalated, and then did something that I will not describe to you, because the description does not serve any useful purpose. I waited. The humans responded, he said simply, and the Kovari ceased. Ceased, I said. What does that mean precisely? It means that the Kovari, as a political entity, as a cultural identity, as a presence in this galaxy, stopped. He looked back at the map. Not all at once. It took some time. The humans were very thorough and very patient. But when it was over, the Kovari were not present in any form that persisted. And the civilizations that had watched, who were at that time the elders of this galaxy, just as we are now, they met and they wrote the rule. They wrote as a warning, I said, not as a description of the humans, as a warning to everyone else. The humans themselves asked for it, he said. They came to the meeting. They sat with the elders of that age, and they said, and I am translating, so forgive the roughness. They said, we did not want this. We do not want this. We ask you to help prevent it from happening again, because we are not proud of what we are when we are made to become it. The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere deeper in the station, I could hear the low hum of the environmental systems, the constant background sound of a place designed to keep many different kinds of beings alive at the same time. They wrote the warning themselves, I said. They wrote the first draft, he said. We carved it. We translated it into every language that existed at the time, and we made sure it was passed down generation to generation, even as languages died and species evolved and the galaxy changed. We kept that one sentence alive, even when the reason for it became a story, and then a legend, and then something even older than legend. I thought about Sarex, standing in the conclave chamber, pointing at the wall and laughing. He doesn't know any of this, I said. No one told him. The mouth of tides said. This is the problem with civilizations that rise quickly. They inherit a galaxy full of rules they did not live through the making of, and they see rules instead of memory. He paused. The Kovari were also very confident. I left him there in the corridor with the old map and walked back toward the archive chamber with a heaviness in my chest that I recognized, after a moment, as fear. Not for myself. Not precisely for the Vetharak, though what was coming for them was not small. I was afraid of what I was about to watch, and of the record I was going to have to write, and of the fact that for the first time in 4,000 years of keeping history, I genuinely did not know what the end of the story would look like. By the time I reached the archive, the conclave monitoring system had flagged a new alert. I sat down, opened the display, and looked at what the long-range sensors in the outer spiral arm had just picked up. The human fleet had arrived. I stared at the sensor readout for a very long time, because the numbers did not make sense to me at first. I kept thinking the system was malfunctioning. I recalibrated the display twice. I called Ol over and asked her to check my settings. She checked them. She looked at the display. She looked at me. She said quietly, "That's not a fleet." No, I agreed. What is it? I did not have an answer for her. What the sensor showed was not organized in the way that fleets are organized. There were no formations, no spread formations, no standard tactical arrangements that any military doctrine I'd studied would recognize. What was on that display was a mass. A dark, dense, moving mass, spread across a region of space so large that the outer spiral arm's transit corridor was entirely blocked. The sensors kept trying to count individual ships and kept producing error codes, not because the instruments were broken, but because the quantity exceeded the parameters their designers had ever thought to account for. Someone, one of the junior monitors on the overnight shift, had put a note in the system log. It said, "Attempted manual count. Gave up. There are a lot." I sat there looking at that quiet, massive thing on the display and thought about the mouth of tides and the Kovari and 5 words on a wall and the people who had written their own warning in the hope that no one would ever make them into the thing the warning described. And somewhere across the chamber, on a secondary display that no one had thought to mute, Sarex was giving a broadcast speech to the Vetharak military network, describing the human response as predictable theater and assuring his commanders that their 40,000 warships were more than adequate. No one in the archive chamber said anything. We watched the display. We waited. I had read every account of every war in Conclave history. I had read the old records, the ones written by lore keepers who had watched empires collapse, who had witnessed the kinds of conflicts that remade the shapes of borders for centuries afterward. I knew what the beginning of a war looked like in a sensor record. I knew the patterns, the advanced scouts, the long-range weapons tests, the opening exchanges that probed for weaknesses before the main engagement. None of that happened. The human fleet, if fleet was even the right word for something that size and shape, simply stopped. It held position at the edge of the Vetharak outer territories and went still. Completely still. No advanced scouts. No provesignals. No weapons tests. Nothing. Just that enormous, dark mass sitting there in the outer spiral arm like a mountain that had decided to move and then thought better of it. The Vetharak sensors were going wild. I had access to their public military frequency, and I listened to the chatter of their commanders trying to process what they were looking at. Confusion, mostly. Then irritation. Then the particular bravado that comes when people are frightened and determined not to show it. Sarex ordered his 40,000 warships to the forward line. It took 3 days to arrange them, which is how large 40,000 warships actually is when you try to move them all at once. The formation they created was impressive by any standard I had ever applied to military arrangements. A deep, layered wall of firepower, shields overlapping, the combined output of 2 centuries of Vetharak weapons development pointed at the human position. The humans did not react. On the 4th day, 1 ship left the human formation. A single vessel. I pulled up its profile on the monitoring feed and stared at it for a while, try to understand what I was looking at. It was small. Not small the way a scout ship is small. Small the way a personal transport is small, the kind of ship that carries a dozen passengers between stations. Against the backdrop of 40,000 Vetharak warships, it was barely visible on the display, a speck crossing the void between the 2 forces with no escort, no weapon signature, no defensive field active. It crossed the entire distance between the human formation and the Vetharak line at a calm, steady speed. The Vetharak commanders did not fire on it. I think they were too confused. I think they were also, underneath the confusion, doing a fast calculation about what kind of civilization sends 1 small ship to meet 40,000 warships, and what that might say about how confident that civilization was in what it had brought to this situation. The ship hailed the Vetharak flagship directly. After a delay of several minutes, during which I assumed someone on the Vetharak side was trying to decide whether to respond or simply pretend they had not heard, the channel was opened. The Conclave monitoring system automatically pulled the feed. I watched it live. The human who appeared on the channel was a woman. She looked to be in the middle years of a human life, which is difficult to estimate, but which I would guess at 40 to 50 of their planetary years, with dark hair cut short and a face that was, at that moment, absolutely still. Not calm the way someone is calm when nothing is wrong. Calm the way water is calm on a very cold morning, when the surface is completely smooth and there is no way to see how deep it goes. She gave her name. Lieutenant Commander Nora Grieve. She gave her rank and vessel designation, the same way a person states facts. Here is a fact, here is another fact, here is the next one. Then she said she had something she needed to read to the Vetharak command. Sarex's adjutant appeared in frame, which meant Sarex himself was listening but not visible. The adjutant said, with the tone of someone trying to project control over a situation that felt less and less controllable, that the warlord was prepared to hear a surrender proposal. Nora Grieve said, without any change in expression, "This is not a surrender proposal." Then she began to read. What she read was a list of names. Every person who had lived on Caro Landing. All 43,000 of them. Not as a statistic, not as a collective noun, not as colonists or civilians or inhabitants. Names. Individual names, in the order they appeared in the colony's population registry, which began with the first family to file a homestead claim 6 generations ago and ended with a child who had been born 11 weeks before the Vetharak ships arrived. She read clearly and at an even pace, and she did not rush. She did not editorialize or comment. She simply read the names, one after another, with the same steady voice that she might use to read a navigation chart or a maintenance log, except that it was not a navigation chart and it was not a maintenance log. It was 43,000 people, and she was saying each of them out loud into the channel that was open to the Vetharak command and, through the monitoring network, to every listening post and relay station in the outer spiral arm. The transmission took 41 minutes. I do not know what Sarex did during those 41 minutes. I do not know whether he sat and listened or whether he left the room or whether he ordered the channel cut, because the channel could not be cut. The human ship was broadcasting on a frequency that overlaid the standard channel rather than using it, a technical approach I had never seen before, one that our communication specialist later spent a long time studying and never quite fully explained. The conclave monitoring room was silent for all 41 minutes. No one left. No one spoke. Ol sat at her desk with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on the display, and I watched her face change slowly over that 41 minutes in a way that I think will stay with me for the rest of my life. When the last name had been read, Nora Grieve paused for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "We will be in contact again when we are ready. Please do not interpret our silence as hesitation." The channel closed. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the human fleet moved. Not toward the Vetharak line. Not in the way I expected, in the way that wars begin, with the forward elements crossing the distance and the weapons firing and the whole catastrophic machinery of combat starting up. The fleet moved in multiple directions at once, spreading out, and it took me a moment to understand what I was looking at because the movements did not match any tactical doctrine I had ever cataloged. They were not going for the warships. They were going for everything else. Vetharak supply lines, communication relays, fuel depots, the automated logistics systems that moved material from the Dominion's industrial worlds to its military positions, the transit corridors that connected its outer territories to its inner ones. Every piece of infrastructure that allowed 40,000 warships to function as an organized military force rather than a very large collection of very expensive machines floating in space without fuel or orders or the ability to talk to each other. I pulled up the Vetharak military frequency again. The chatter had changed completely. It was no longer bravado. It was the sound of systems going offline, one by one, in an order that someone had clearly planned in advance, with a thoroughness that spoke of detailed knowledge of the Vetharak logistics network that the Vetharak themselves would have found alarming if they had stopped to think about how it had been obtained. Sarex ordered his fleet to pursue. His warships were fast and powerful, and they gave chase with everything they had. The humans led them in circles. Not deliberately mocking circles. Tactical circles, each one pulling the pursuing warships slightly farther from the positions they were supposed to be defending, slightly farther from the supply lines that were going dark behind them. I watched the Vetharak commanders realize what was happening and try to reverse course, and find that reversing course meant leaving the chase. And leaving the chase meant accepting that the enemy was doing something they could not stop, and no Vetharak commander in the history of the Dominion had ever said those words into an official record. So they kept chasing. and the supply lines kept going dark. And then the human ships began landing on planets. Not the military installations, not the command posts or the weapons platforms or any of the obvious military targets. They landed on the outer colony worlds, the civilian ones, the agricultural planets, and the mining settlements, and the small trading posts that existed at the edges of the Dominion's territory. And the first thing they did on every single planet where they landed was distribute food. I received a field report from a conclave observer stationed at one of those outer worlds, a small agricultural moon called Vesh 9, and I read it 3 times because I thought I had misunderstood it. The observer described human supply ships landing in the main settlement's open ground, and then the ship crews beginning to unload containers of food and medical supplies and water purification units, and then setting up a distribution point, and then working their way through the settlement for 6 hours, making sure every civilian family had what they needed, and then leaving. No demands, no conditions, no announcement of occupation or conquest, just supplies left behind and humans who said very little except to ask, politely, if everyone was all right. The observer's final note read, I asked one of the human crew members why they were doing this. She said, "These are not our enemy. Our enemy is the one who gave orders. We do not punish people for the choices their leaders made." I sat with that note for a long time. On the other side of the display, the Vetharak fleet was still chasing the human ships that kept leading them in careful, unhurried loops, and the darkness where the supply lines used to be was spreading outward like a tide, and Sarex was on the military channel shouting orders in a voice that had lost, somewhere in the last several hours, its particular quality of certainty. I found, in that moment, that I was not afraid anymore. Or rather, I was afraid, but it was a different kind of fear. Not the fear of something approaching that you cannot stop. Something closer to the feeling of standing at a very great height and understanding, for the first time, how high you actually are. Ol came to stand on my shoulder. She looked at the display for a while without speaking. Then she said, very quietly, they planned this. Yes, I said, all of it. The supply landings, the logistics targeting, the list of names. She paused. They planned everything except how they treated the civilians. Why do you say that? I asked, though I already knew. Because you cannot plan that, she said. That's just what they are. I did not answer because there was nothing to add. She was right, and we both knew she was right, and somewhere in the outer spiral arm, a woman named Nora Grieve was sitting in a small ship between 2 enormous forces, and the names of 43,000 people were still moving outward through the relay network at the speed of light, reaching farther and farther in the galaxy, a list that would not stop until it had been heard by everyone. It was not a weapon. It was not a tactic. It was a record, and I am a lore keeper, and I understood, perhaps before anyone else did, exactly what it meant that they had opened this the way a lore keeper opens a case file. They were not fighting a war. They were building a record, and they intended, when the record was complete, to present it. The conclave chamber had never been louder, and I had attended sessions during 3 separate interspecies wars, 2 succession crises, and the great dispute of the Dorith border, which had once lasted 19 consecutive hours and ended with 4 delegates requiring medical attention. I know loud conclave sessions. This was different. This was the particular loudness of people who are very frightened and are trying to make enough noise to convince themselves otherwise. Every delegation was present. Not just the senior delegates, the backbench observers, the junior staff, the technical advisors who normally sat in the outer gallery and took notes and did not speak. All of them, packed into the chamber with the kind of density that the architects had not originally designed for, because no one had ever anticipated a situation in which every member of every conclave delegation would feel that being in the room was more important than anything else they might be doing. On the main display, updated in real time from the outer spiral arm monitoring network, the situation map showed what the last 4 days had produced. The Vetharak fleet, 40,000 ships, was scattered across 6 different sectors in pursuit of human vessels that refused to be caught. Their supply network was down to 30% of normal function. 3 of their major communication relay chains were offline. And on 11 outer colony worlds, Human ground teams were still distributing supplies to civilian populations, quietly, efficiently, without having fired a single weapon at any non-military target. The Vetharak delegates were in the chamber as well, in their section, and the quality of their presence had changed in a way that was difficult to define precisely. They had arrived at this session still carrying some version of the posture they had maintained for 2 years of Dominion membership in the Conclave. The posture of people who believed they were the most significant thing in the room. That posture was not entirely gone, but it had cracks in it now, and through the cracks, something else was showing. Sarex was not present in person. He was commanding from his flagship, which was still in the outer spiral arm and was still, technically, functional, though its communications with the Dominion's inner worlds have been reduced by the loss of the relay chains to a fraction of their normal capacity. He was present via screen, his image projected on a secondary display, and even through the transmission quality, I could see that he had not slept recently. The conclave chair called the session to order 17 times before the noise reduced enough to make speech possible. Then the floor opened, and what followed was 2 hours of declarations, protests, proposed resolutions, counterproposals, demands for immediate human withdrawal, demands for Vetharak withdrawal, requests for ceasefire brokerage, arguments about jurisdiction, arguments about precedent, arguments about the applicability of various charter articles to a situation that no charter article had ever been written to address. I recorded all of it. That is my job. What I was actually thinking about during all of it was a meeting request that had arrived in my personal queue 4 hours before the session began. It was from a human diplomatic liaison named Owen Farr, and it said, in the direct and slightly unadorned way that human diplomatic communications always had, Lore Keeper Velcon, we would like to speak with you, not as a formal conclave matter. Informally, if you are willing. We believe you have questions that we can answer, and we have a request that we believe you are the right person to help us with. Please advise at your convenience. I had not yet responded. I was still deciding whether to, not because I did not want to, but because I was unsettled by the phrase, we believe you are the right person. In 4,000 years, I had never been the right person for anything that happened outside the archive. I was a record keeper. I kept records. The galaxy happened around me, and I wrote it down. I thought about that during the session, while the chamber debated and argued and failed to reach any agreement, and the display updated every 15 minutes to show the current status of the outer spiral arm, which was continuing to change in ways that the Vetharak were not managing to prevent. The thing that no one in the chamber was quite saying, the thing that everyone was thinking that I could see in the way they looked at the display and then quickly looked somewhere else, was that the humans had not, at this point, engaged the Vetharak military in any direct combat exchange. Not once. They had disrupted, diverted, and systematically dismantled the Dominion's logistical capability. They had occupied civilian worlds and provided aid rather than demands. They had sent one small ship to read 43,000 names across an open channel, and 40,000 warships were chasing them in circles. There is a military concept that I encountered in my research into historical conflicts, old enough that most modern strategists would consider it quaint. The idea of fighting a war not to defeat an enemy, but to demonstrate to that enemy, and more importantly, to everyone watching, that the enemy cannot win. That the asymmetry of capability is so absolute that continuing the conflict is not a tactical question, but a psychological one. And the only remaining variable is how long the losing side takes to understand what the outcome already is. No one had done this in recorded conclave history. It required a quality that no species involved in a conflict had ever reliably managed, which was the ability to be certain enough in your position that you could afford to be patient and measured and to avoid any action that would complicate the record you were building. The record. I kept coming back to that. The list of names. The supply distributions documented with careful specificity. Who received what, on which world at what time, confirmed by independent conclave observers who had been present on several of the planets by coincidence when human ships arrived. The disabled Vetharak warships, none of them destroyed, all of them boarded and their command logs and order files copied with what I later learned was extraordinary technical precision. They were collecting documentation of what had been done to Carroll Landing, and they were simultaneously creating documentation of how they were conducting their response. Every civilian aided, every warship disabled rather than destroyed, every communication logged and preserved. I thought, they're not just going to defeat the Vetharak. They're going to prove something, and the proof has to hold up in front of everyone. After the session ended without resolution, the chair tabled all proposed measures pending further development. I went back to my desk and replied to Owen Farr's message. I said I was available the following morning. He arrived precisely on time, which I had expected. He was a compact, quiet man with a way of moving that suggested he was always aware of how much space he was occupying and was careful not to occupy more than he needed. He sat down across from my desk and placed his hands flat on the surface, not folded, just resting, and he looked at me with the clear, direct attention that humans gave to things they were genuinely interested in. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. "I have questions," I said, because there was no point in beginning anywhere else. "I know," he said. "Ask them. Why are you doing this the way you are doing it?" I said, "You have the capability for a direct military engagement. The sensor data makes that obvious. Why the logistics targeting, the civilian aid, the documentation? Why not simply respond with force and end it quickly?" He considered this for a moment, not as if the answer was difficult, but as if he was choosing how to present it accurately. "Force would end the conflict," he said. "It would not end what needs to end, which is the question of what happened," he said. "Not what happened in the military sense, who won, who lost. What happened in the sense of what was done, to whom, by whose decision, under what authority, and whether the people of the Vetharak Dominion who had no part in that decision should carry the consequences of it." He paused. "If we simply destroyed Serex's fleet and moved on, the history of this event would be shaped by the people who survived it and had an interest in how it was remembered. We are not interested in letting that happen." I sat with that for a moment. "So, the documentation is the point," he said simply. "Yes. The military action enables the documentation by limiting Serex's ability to destroy evidence and disrupt our access. The civilian aid creates an independent record of our conduct that cannot be disputed. When this is over, there will be a complete, verified, independently witnessed account of what was done and how every party behaved. That account will exist in conclave archives, which I understand are the most durable and trusted record-keeping system in this part of the galaxy." He looked at me steadily when he said that last part. "The conclave archives." "My archives." "The request," I said. "We need a conclave lorekeeper to formally certify the documentation record," he said. "Not as a partisan, not on our behalf, simply as what you are, the keeper of the official historical record of this galaxy. We want what happened to Carroll Landing and everything that follows it to be part of the permanent archive. Not a human account, not a Vetharak account. The account, the one that is kept by the people whose job it is to keep things." I looked at him for a long time. 4,000 years of history moved through my mind in an undifferentiated rush. The wars and treaties and rise and fall of things, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, 5 words on a wall. "You wrote the rule," I said. "The original draft." Something shifted in his face. Not surprise. He had known I would get here eventually. Something more like the expression of someone who has been holding a weight for a very long time and has just been offered a chance to set it down. "Our people did, yes. A long time ago. Because you were afraid of what you became," I said. "Because we were sorry for what we became," he said quietly. "There is a difference. Fear keeps you from doing things. Being sorry makes you want to build something different in the space where the thing you regret used to be." He looked at his hands, flat on the desk. "We have never stopped being sorry. We carry the Kovari in our historical record. Their full record, the one we kept when everyone else's was lost." As a reminder, the chamber was very quiet. Outside, the galaxy was in the middle of the largest military action since the Conclave's founding century. And in this room, a man was telling me that his people had spent 6,000 years keeping the memory of those they had harmed, not as a trophy, but as an obligation. "I will certify the record," I said. He nodded, and the weight I had imagined was there in his face did, in fact, seemed to shift a little. There is one more thing, he said. Yes. Sarex, he said. When this is over, we will need him alive and present for the formal proceedings. We will not be executing him or exiling him or doing anything that removes him from the record in a way that allows the record to be disputed. He needs to be part of the process. It is the only way the process means anything. I understood what he was asking without him having to say it more plainly. The Conclave's authority, the one thing that the Vetharak could not dismiss or override, was the only force that could compel Sarex's presence and cooperation in a formal proceeding. And the only person who could invoke that authority with enough credibility to make it stick was a Conclave official with no military or political stake in the outcome. A lorekeeper, someone whose only role was to keep the record straight. I will prepare the formal summons, I said. He stood and extended his hand, and I took it, which is a human custom that I had always found awkward in the past, but which in this moment felt exactly right. Then he left, and I sat down at my desk and opened a new document. At the top, I wrote, Formal Notification and Summons, under authority of the Conclave Charter, Article 91, Subsection 3, to be delivered to Warlord Sarex of the Vetharak Dominion, commanding officer of the Vetharak military. Then I stopped, and I thought about 43,000 names. And I started writing. Sarex's flagship was called the Vorith Ka, which translates from the Vetharak formal language as something like the strike that decides. It was a very large ship, the largest in his fleet, built over 12 years in the Dominion's primary orbital yard, with weapon systems that the Vetharak military had spent a decade developing specifically to counter the defense platforms of the neighboring civilizations they had planned to absorb next. It was, without question, the most powerful single vessel the Vetharak had ever built. On the morning that Nora Grief's ship arrived at the Vorthka's position, alone, again, the same small vessel, crossing open space without escort. The Vorthka had functioning weapons, a full crew, and complete command and control over approximately 12,000 warships, which was what remained of Sarex's fleet after 3 weeks of what the Vetharak military channels were now calling, with increasing desperation, redeployment exercises. The other 28,000 ships were not destroyed. They were simply not where Sarex needed them to be. Some were stranded without fuel in sectors whose supply depots had gone quiet. Some were in pursuit of human vessels that continued to decline to be caught. Some were in positions that had seemed tactically important 3 weeks ago and were now simply far away from everything else. The Vorith Ka, for all its power, was alone in a way that no flagship was supposed to be alone. Sarex opened the channel himself this time. I was watching the feed live, and I could see in his face the particular expression of someone who has spent 3 weeks being carefully, methodically, and thoroughly outmaneuvered and has arrived at the stage of understanding that is sometimes the most dangerous stage because people in that stage sometimes make large and irreversible decisions. Nora Grieve appeared on his screen. She looked the same as she had on the first transmission. The same stillness, the same quality of water at low temperature. Sarex spoke first. He spoke for several minutes. He said things about the inevitability of the Vetharak victory, about the waste of continued conflict, about the terms he was prepared to offer for a resolution that would allow both parties to withdraw with their positions intact. He spoke with the cadence of someone who has prepared a speech and is delivering it regardless of the room, because the speech is the last piece of structure available, and without it there's only the situation as it actually is. Nora Grieve listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, which I was beginning to understand was a human habit. That brief pause, that space between hearing and speaking that most species do not leave. Warlord Sarex, she said, I am not authorized to negotiate terms. He stared at her. Then what are you here for? To tell you that a formal conclave summons has been filed, she said, by Lorekeeper Velcon, under Charter Article 91. You are requested to appear before the conclave within 30 standard days to respond to a formal record of events beginning with the raid on Caro Landing. The summons carries the signatures of 47 of the 60 conclave member civilizations. She paused. That includes 11 civilizations that have previously been aligned with the Dominion. The silence on Cerex's end was a different kind of silence than the ones I had been observing for the past weeks. It was the silence of a calculation happening very fast and arriving at a number that the calculator did not want to accept. 47, he said. 47, she confirmed. And if I decline to appear? The conclave charter provides for representation in absentia, she said, in which case the record is certified without your testimony and the findings stand without a response from your side. The lorekeeper has certified the complete documentation record. It includes the original orders issued for the Caro landing operation, recovered from your command vessels. She paused again. All of them. I watched his face go through several things in rapid succession. Then he said, very quietly, "You boarded my ships." "We collected evidence," she said. "Yes." A long silence. "I want to speak with the conclave chair," he said. "That is your right," she said. "The summons contains the contact information. I would note that the chair has already indicated the conclave's willingness to receive your delegation." She looked at him steadily. "Warlord, I want to be direct with you. You made a decision that had consequences for 43,000 people who had no part in any dispute between our civilizations. What comes next is not revenge. It is a record. You will be part of that record in whatever form you choose to take. But the record will exist regardless." Sarex looked at her for a long time. Then he looked away. Nora Grieve closed the channel. Her ship turned back toward the human formation, which had not moved from its position at the edge of Vetharak space, and crossed the void at the same calm, unhurried speed it had arrived with. I sat back in my chair and thought about Oenfar and what he had said about sorry versus afraid, and about building something in the space where the thing you regret used to be. The Vetharak military channel, which I had been monitoring continuously, went quiet for about an hour. Then Sarex's adjutant filed a communication with the conclave chair's office. Formal acceptance of summons, agreement to appear within the required period, request for procedural guidance on delegation composition. Not a surrender, a procedural filing. I thought that was actually correct. The most correct thing Sarex had done since this began. Because this had never been about winning and losing in the military sense. It was about a process. A record, a reckoning conducted through the only mechanism that gave it any meaning beyond the immediate, which was the formal attention of the civilization that kept the history of this galaxy. My civilization, my archive. I pulled up the summons document I had spent 4 days preparing and read through it one final time. It was the most carefully written document of my career. Every fact verified, every source cited, every piece of evidence cross-referenced with independent observation records. I had written thousands of historical documents in 4,000 years of this work, but this one was different, and I had felt the difference in every line of it. This one was not just history. This one was going to do something. Ol brought me a cup of the hot liquid I drink in the late hours when the archive is quiet, and she set it on my desk without comment. And then she sat down at her own desk across the room and looked at the display where the situation map was updating with the slow, steady movement of circumstances toward conclusion. "He filed," she said. "Yes," I said. "What happens at the conclave proceeding?" "He answers the record," I said. "His command staff answers the record. The documentation of what was done to Caro Landing is presented in full, with all the evidence attached. The conclave votes on findings. If the findings are certified by a 2/3 majority, they become part of the permanent historical record under my seal and cannot be challenged, disputed, or removed by any party. And then the Vetharak Dominion has to decide what to do with a government whose leadership has a permanent, sealed, conclave-certified historical record of what they ordered." I picked up the cup. "That is not a decision anyone else makes for them." Ol was quiet. Then she said, "The humans are not asking for territory, not reparations, not a formal apology or a change of government." "No," I said, "just the record." "Just the record," I agreed. She sat with that for a moment. "That's either the most generous thing I have ever heard of or the most devastating." I said carefully, that those two things are the same thing. I think that is what makes it both. She nodded slowly. Then she turned back to her desk, and I turned back to mine, and outside the archive the station continued its quiet hum, and in the outer spiral arm the human fleet held its position without aggression, without urgency, without anything that could be described as threat, because it did not need to threaten anything. The record was almost complete, and once it was complete, it would simply exist. That was enough. That had always been enough. I understood, finally, why the rule was old. Not because what humans did in conflict was so terrible that it needed to be written in warning at the founding of this galaxy civilization, but because the combination of things they were, the capacity for grief and the capacity for patience and the capacity for mercy, extended even to those who had not earned it, and underneath all of it, that absolute bedrock certainty about what they were willing to do when someone left them no other choice. That combination was something the galaxy had never developed a category for. You could not bargain with it. You could not outmaneuver it. You could not simply absorb the loss it inflicted and rebuild, because it did not inflict loss in ways you could rebuild from. It inflicted truth, and it made the truth permanent. And truth that is permanent and cannot be disputed is the one thing that no amount of power or resources or military capability can undo. The Kovari had not been erased by human weapons. They had been erased by their own inability to exist as what they were in a galaxy that now had a clear, permanent, undeniable record of what they had done. And the humans had kept that record. For 6,000 years, in their own archive, the history of the people they had once fought and broken, kept not as victory, but as reminder, as the thing they did not want to become again, and kept the memory of their worst chapter to make sure they remembered why. I sat very still for a while, holding my cup, thinking about what it meant to keep a record like that, about what kind of civilization does that, about the fact that the most dangerous beings in this galaxy were, at their foundation, people who were sorry. The conclave session for the formal proceedings was set for the first day of the third month, and it was the most attended session in conclave history. Not just the delegates, observers from civilizations that had no formal conclave membership requested access and were granted it, because the charter allows for public observation of formal record proceedings, and because the conclave chair, an elderly Vresi named Lita Moss, who had held the position for 40 years and had the calm of someone who had survived every kind of crisis this institution could generate, decided early that transparency was the only appropriate response to this particular situation. The chamber was configured differently for formal record proceedings. The delegate desks were pushed back and replaced by a central space, an open area with a speaking position in the middle, the way the original conclave had been arranged 600 years ago when it was first built, before the membership grew large enough to require the current arrangement. In the center of that open space, in the speaking position, there was a single chair. Sarex arrived with 6 members of his command staff, as the summons had specified. He was in his formal Vetharak military dress, which is an elaborate thing involving many layers of silver fabric and a great deal of structured shoulders, and he walked into the chamber with his back straight and his chin level, which I gave him credit for, because the chamber was completely silent when he entered, and completely silent in that particular way, with 800 beings in it and not one of them making a sound, is a very heavy kind of silence to walk into. He sat in the chair in the center of the floor. His staff took positions behind him. He looked at the conclave membership arranged in their tiers around him, and then he looked at me, standing at the lore keeper's position to the chair's left, the formal position of the record keeper during proceedings. I held his gaze for a moment. Then I opened the proceedings in the traditional form, the same words that have opened conclave formal record sessions for 600 years, because some things should be said the same way every time. What followed was 3 days. I will not detail all 3 days here, because the full record is filed and certified, and anyone who wishes to read it may do so. What I will describe is what I remember of it, not as lore keeper, but as witness. Sarek spoke. He was, and I note this without pleasure or satisfaction, an intelligent being. He had prepared carefully. He challenged the documentation on technical grounds, questioned the chain of custody for certain pieces of evidence, raised procedural objections, at appropriate points. His legal staff, who had joined the delegation, were competent and thorough. The documentation held. Every challenge was met with cross-referenced evidence, independent observations, and in several cases the testimony of Vetharak civilian witnesses from the occupied worlds who had agreed, voluntarily, to speak to the record. The conclave observer from Vesh 9 read her field report directly into the record, the one that included the human crew member who said, "These are not our enemy." On the second day, Nora Grieve spoke. She had no legal status in the proceedings. She was not an accuser, not a prosecutor, not a party in the conclave sense. She spoke as a witness, at my invitation, which the charter permits for formal record proceedings when the lore keeper certifies relevance. She spoke for 4 hours. She described the raid on Caro Landing in precise, factual terms, drawing from the documentation record. She described the human government's decision-making process in the weeks following, including the internal debates about how to respond, including the voices that had argued for a direct military strike and been outvoted. She described the objectives of the response and how each had been achieved or not yet achieved. Then, at the end of her testimony, she did something I had not expected. She addressed the chamber directly. "I want to say something to the Vetharak citizens watching this proceeding," she said, and I noticed that she was not looking at Sarex when she said it. She was looking at the secondary display, the public broadcast feed, the one being relayed to every monitoring station and relay point in the galaxy. Not to the government, to the people. She paused. "We do not believe you are defined by what your leaders chose to do," she said. "We do not believe the people of a civilization are the same as the decisions of the people who govern them. We know this because we have been governed badly ourselves in our own history, and we know how that feels, and we do not wish that feeling on anyone who did not make the choices that created it." She paused again. "The record we are creating here today is not a record of the Vetharak people. It is a record of specific decisions made by specific individuals. We ask the conclave to remember that distinction, and we ask you, the people of the Dominion watching this, to know that our ships on your colony worlds brought supplies and asked for nothing in return, because that is what we believe you deserved, regardless of what was done in your name." The chamber was absolutely silent. Then one of the Vetharak command staff behind Sarex, a woman named Karov Som, his intelligence chief, who had been sitting with her hands folded and her face still for 2 days, leaned forward and spoke, not in any formal record-keeping channel, but simply out loud, into the room. "We did not vote for it," she said. "The raid. We were not consulted. We were given orders. Several things happened at once." Sarex turned to look at her. His legal staff moved. The conclave chair's hand went to the formal order bell. I lifted mine, and the chair looked at me, and I said, "Formally, for the record, the lore keeper notes that a member of the Vetharak delegation has made a voluntary statement and requests the opportunity to speak further into the record." The chair looked at Sarex. She looked at Nora Grieve. She looked at the 800 beings in the chamber. Then she said, "The statement is noted. The witness may continue if she chooses." Karasam looked at Sarex for a moment. What passed between them, I cannot say. Then she looked away from him and looked at me, and she said, "I want to speak into the record." What followed was 6 hours that I will say, without hesitation, were the most significant 6 hours of my career. Karasam spoke. Others among the staff spoke. The pattern that emerged from their testimony was one that historians will study for a very long time. The pattern of how a government convinces the people who work for it that the things it does are acceptable, and how, when the record is placed in front of those people in a room full of witnesses and the weight of it becomes real, some of them find that their loyalty does not extend to protecting a record that cannot be protected. Sarex said very little by the end of the 3rd day. He had arrived with a posture. He had arrived with a strategy. Both had been superseded by the record. On the morning of the 4th day, the conclave membership voted. The motion was simple: to certify the documentation record as the official historical account of the events beginning with the Vetharak raid on Caro Landing. The vote was 54-6. The 6 who voted against were the Vetharak delegates themselves, which I noted in the record as appropriate and expected, as they were the subject of the proceedings and their objection was itself part of the record. I signed the certification. My seal, the lore keeper's seal, the one that has been passed from keeper to keeper for 4,000 years, went on the document, and the document became permanent. The chamber was quiet for a long moment after I announced the certification. Then from somewhere in the observer gallery, I could not see who, someone began to make a sound that I recognized after a moment as their civilization's form of acknowledgement, a low, resonant tone, and then others joined it, different sounds from different species, and none of them were the sounds of victory or celebration, which is not what the moment called for. They were the sounds of beings who had witnessed something they understood to be important and were acknowledging that they had seen it. The sound of a record being received. Owen Farr was in the gallery. I found him afterward in the corridor outside, and I gave him a copy of the certification document, the physical copy printed on material that will survive for several thousand years, which is the standard for conclave permanent records. He held it carefully. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Thank you." I said, "I have one more question." "Of course," he said. "Was any of this planned?" I asked. "The specific way you conducted the response, the documentation strategy, the civilian aid, the 41 minutes of names." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We planned for the conflict. We had contingencies for military action, for logistics targeting, for occupation of civilian worlds. We had planned the documentation procedure very carefully. That part was deliberate from the beginning." He paused. The civilian aid, the supplies, the crews on the ground, the way they were with people, we told them the objective. We told them what they were there to do. We did not tell them how to do it. He looked at the document in his hands. They just did it the way they do things. I thought about the field report from Vesh 9, the human crew member who said, "These are not our enemy." "And the names," I said. "Nora Grieve. The list." He smiled. It was a small smile, and there was grief in it. "That was her," he said simply. "She knew every one of them. She had read the colony's registry before she left. She said she wanted them to be people, not a number, not a cause. She said the least she could do was say their names where someone had to hear them." He paused. "She said it was just the right thing to do. Just the right thing to do." I thought about that phrase for a long time. Not a strategy, not a tactic, not a calculated move in a larger game. The right thing to do, done because it was right, by a person who had the presence of mind to know what that meant in the moment she was standing in. What do you do with a species like that? I walked back to my archive chamber and sat down at my desk and opened a record that I've been building slowly, in private, not as an official document, but as something else, something for myself, or perhaps for whatever lore keeper comes after me, the way the mouth of tides had made sure the story of the Kovari reached me even after 6,000 years. The Vetharak Dominion, in the months that followed the certification, went through the process that Serex's adjutant had attempted to call redeployment and now called, with the particular courage that comes from having run out of alternatives, internal reform. It was messy and uneven and produced 3 different governmental crises in the first year. Karev-san became part of a transitional council. Sarex resigned his position and was replaced, then the replacement was replaced. The thing that happens when a government has to face its own record, with no ability to alter or deny it, had begun. It would take a generation. Owen Farr told me that, plainly, when I asked. "These things take a generation," he said. "You cannot reform a civilization in a year, but you can make the truth available and wait for the generation that grows up knowing it." He paused. "We are good at waiting." 17 months after the certification, the Transitional Council of the Vetharak Dominion submitted a formal application for full conclave membership, not the observer membership they had previously held, which had been suspended during the proceedings. Full membership, with all the obligations that entailed. The application required a sponsor from the current membership. The sponsoring civilization was the Terran Commonwealth, the humans. I read the sponsorship letter 3 times because I could not quite believe what I was reading, not because it was surprising. I had, by that point, spent enough time studying human history to know that this was entirely consistent with every pattern I had found. but because I could not fully process what it meant to sponsor the admission of the civilization you had just held accountable through the most significant formal record proceeding in conclave history. I contacted Owen Farr. Why? I asked. Because they asked, he said. Because they are trying. Because a civilization that is genuinely trying deserves to be part of the institution that holds the galaxy's shared rules. He was quiet for a moment. And because we remember what it felt like to be outside, looking in, carrying the weight of things we had done, and we do not wish that it be permanent for anyone who is genuinely willing to be different. The application was approved at the next session. 49 in favor, 11 abstentions, no votes against. I watched it happen from my position at the lorekeeper's desk, and I thought about the rule and about the Kovari and about Kara Sam and her 6 hours of testimony, and about a field report from a small world where human crew members had asked the colonists if they were all right. I thought about Nora Grieve, reading names for 41 minutes into an open channel. I thought about a warning written by the people it warned against, given freely to the galaxy because they were sorry. And then I sat down and I wrote the final entry in the record I had been keeping, the one that began with the sentence, "The rule was broken." The final entry was not about the military engagement or the proceedings or the vote. It was about something I had seen on a different monitor during the occupation of a Vetharak outer colony world in a piece of routine surveillance footage that no one else had paid much attention to because the situation map was more important at the time. A human soldier, young, in standard issue kit, carrying a supply container, had sat down on the ground outside a settlement building where a group of Vetharak civilians were waiting. Next to him, a Vetharak man, somewhere in middle age, had been sitting alone. The human soldier had opened a pocket and produced a small set of cards, the kind humans use for a particular category of games that I had encountered in their cultural records, and had begun demonstrating something, laying cards down and pointing, and after a few minutes the Vetharak man had responded, and after a few more minutes they were both looking at the cards, and the human soldier said something, and the Vetharak man laughed. Just laughed. In the middle of all of it. That is why I wrote at the end. Not the statistics, or the political outcomes, or the legal significance of the certification. That moment. That laugh. Because I believe, and I want whoever reads this record after me to understand, that this is the actual answer to the question every new civilization asks when they walk through the conclave doors and look at the wall. Why does the rule exist? Not because humans are the most destructive force this galaxy has ever known, though the evidence suggests they are capable of being exactly that. Not because they are unmerciful or without limit. The rule exists because they're all of those things, and also, somehow, simultaneously, the kind of people who sit down on the ground next to a stranger who has every reason to fear them and pull out a deck of cards and make them laugh. The rule exists because no civilization that has ever produced a combination like that has been remotely predictable, and nothing in this galaxy is more dangerous than a force you cannot predict, and nothing is more worth trying to understand. I carve a new line beneath the old one. Not officially. I did not have the authority, and the wall is a historical artifact, and conclave preservation protocols apply. But in my own copy of the archive, the one I keep in the format that will survive the longest, I wrote it beneath the original 5 words. Do not cross the humans. And below that, because if you survive it, you will spend the rest of your life wishing you had been better. And perhaps that is the more important lesson. Not the warning. The possibility that comes after the warning, if you are fortunate enough to still be here to learn it. I am Vel